Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare has one of the most intense set pieces in franchise history when a nuclear bomb is detonated during the Shock and Awe mission. Your group of Marines goes from being on top of the world and essentially wrapping up and winning the entire battle to being wiped out in an instant.
Something has happened.
I had to spend a lot of time researching this specific scene for my Counting Every War Crime in every Call of Duty series, and I realized that there's enough to talk about just here to be worth its own video. So, just how devastating was that nuclear explosion in Shock and Awe? No firm details about the bomb itself are ever clearly given in any of the original 3 Modern Warfare games, so to even begin to determine the payload of the explosion, we need to take in as many context clues as we can, and then do some further sleuthing from there. First, we actually get a good look at another similar nuclear weapon during the Crew Expendable mission, which is sitting inside a shipping container. Based off of what we can see here, we can start to determine just how much yield that warhead could hold. Helpfully, a Reddit thread, ironically from a user that I promise isn't me, named What War Crimes, breaks down the size of the weapon we see in the shipping container is actually pretty comparable to the Fat Man bomb that was dropped over Nagasaki during World War II. Now, by modern standards especially, the Fat Man's 20 kiloton yield is a wet fart in comparison to the average warhead in the United States arsenal, which is now an apocalyptic 350 kilotons. We can further back up this initial payload estimate from something that General Shepard says in Modern Warfare 2.
5 years ago, I lost 30,000 men in the blink of an eye. And the world just fucking watched.
US forces taking 30,000 casualties essentially instantly backs up this weapon being similar in size to the Fat Man. When the Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki, a staggering 35 to 45,000 people were killed instantly, with further casualties following in the fallout weeks, months, and years after. However, to determine the full impact of Call of Duty's explosion, we need to factor in some additional points and data. 1. Fat Man was the 3rd nuclear weapon ever built. It was extremely crude and inefficient compared to what we are now capable of creating. So, even at this size, we can assume at least a slightly higher yield than what was built in 1945, and for the sake of argument, let's just say that this is a 30 kiloton bomb. 2. The Fat Man detonation was an air burst which happened at around 500 meters, which is significantly more devastating because of the air pressure wave created, and it has further reaching consequences from fallout. We know that the Shock and Awe detonation happened at surface level since we hear over the radio that ground control teams are moving in to secure the bomb before it detonates.
All U.S. forces be advised. We have a confirmed nuclear threat in the city. NEST teams are on site and attempting to disarm.
Next, we need to determine the location that this mission takes place in, or at least find a real-world analog for our estimates. Unlike the Modern Warfare reboots, the original trilogy uses a lot of real locations and countries for its setting, even if things aren't explicitly named. We know that al-Assad, the secondary antagonist who kicks off the Middle Eastern conflict in the series, begins his coup by killing President al-Fulani of Saudi Arabia. But it seems implied that from there he begins to take over and assimilate other Middle Eastern countries as well. Because of this, there's a lot of conflicting assertions about where the Shock and Awe mission actually takes place. Really strong arguments can be made that the mission actually takes place in the town of Suzangerd, Iran, as based on the satellite view showed during the mission intro, it is the closest urban environment on the map. However, that's a little confusing as the voiceover narration calls the area the capital city and that they are closing in on al-Assad's palace. Suzangerd is not large or well connected enough to rate as a capital city at all, and it also doesn't have a palace or even a palace-adjacent building. I would also presume that if al-Assad managed to unite multiple Middle Eastern nations, the capital city could be different from the existing ones in those nations, but it would still need to be larger and better connected to facilitate governance over a broad region. The best and most likely option within any geographic distance on the map pictured would actually be the Iraqi city of Basra. It's the 3rd largest city after Mosul and Baghdad, and occupies a more centrally connected point between Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, and relatively is just a little further south of where the map seems to be zooming in on Suzangerd. Now, someone else is going to have to do a dive into if and how anyone could get nations that have a lot of friction between each other to fully unite, as we've got a big boom to talk about. To have the best chance of calculating the overall damage, we are going to have to plug in everything we know into Nuke Map to simulate all of the effects of this explosion going off. Okay, so we've chosen Basra as our location, and from the grainy satellite footage, it appears that the bomb went off in some sort of municipal area. They say it's in al-Assad's palace, so I'm choosing the city's main courthouse as our ground zero. Now, remember, we've determined that the Call of Duty nuke is 30 kilotons, detonated basically at ground level. Let's click detonate and see what happens. Okay, so as you can see, even with a ground detonation, the damage is extensive to the surrounding area, with over 47,000 projected deaths and a further 120,000 injuries, along with a massive cloud of fallout drifting to nearby cities. From the satellite footage and aftermath, I determined that the wind was blowing at 15 miles per hour at about 265 degrees, showing us that that cloud of fallout will spread further to the east. But this simulation is only able to factor in the approximate population of an area and can't factor in the outside elements of the US military or the Op Force soldiers as well. General Shepard's quote tells us that 30,000 United States troops were killed instantly in the blast, which would potentially suggest that even more forces were present beyond the frontline troops if we follow the tooth and tail principle of there being significantly more support troops in the surrounding area who would also suffer from the knockout effects of the fallout. But let's linger on that 30,000 KIA number. The United States was in the Vietnam War for 20 years. Over the course of that time, 58,281 service members were killed. Call of Duty Modern Warfare depicts the US military suffering basically 10 years of Vietnam in approximately 1 minute. The fact that 30,000 plus troops were even in the kill zone of this blast radius is unreal to me. The closest modern US military analog we have to this type of situation would be the Second Battle of Fallujah in Iraq, where the US had 12,000 soldiers involved in some capacity for one urban battle. That 30,000 KIA mark is equivalent to 1.5% of the entire US military, which is an insane loss to take in a few seconds. Now, you might argue that the calculation from Nuke Map is also blowing things out of proportion, as it's factoring in the full civilian population, and in situations like the Second Battle of Fallujah that I referenced, over 70% of the civilian population had the opportunity to flee the city before the battle commenced. But I'm going to make the argument that the US assault is too swift for anyone to have the chance to evacuate, as the first US mission in the Middle East takes place on January 18th, and shock and awe happens on January 19th. Beyond the civilian population and the US military forces, there's also the question of how many enemy soldiers from the Op 4 faction were present in the city at the time of the battle. For this, the only reasonable calculation that I can make is to pull the percentages of coalition troops versus Al-Qaeda during that Second Battle of Fallujah. Opposing forces were about 30% of the coalition's totals. So, in comparison to the confirmed 30,000 US troops in Call of Duty, we can assume that there were about 9,000 Op 4 soldiers present, and therefore wiped out in the city as well. With all of these unspecified specifics now at least loosely determined, we can say that this 30 kiloton nuclear explosion caused at least 86,220 fatalities, with an additional, admittedly lowball estimate of 150,000 moderate to severe injuries. Looking beyond the staggering human toll, I don't even know how to begin to calculate the cost to rebuild this area following an explosion of this magnitude. Now, if the weapon depicted in this scene was on par with the average nuclear payload in most modern militaries, we could easily triple these numbers and the ensuing damage. That's really all I have for you on this topic today. If you found this deep dive interesting, please check out my other videos about all of the war crimes in Call of Duty, or leave me a comment about other scenes in video games that you think are worthy of a deep dive like this. Be kind and do good, gamers. I'll see you very soon.